A speech by Thomas Sankara given on March 8, 1987, in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, for the occasion of International Women's Day. Please bear with me. The revolution cannot triumph without the emancipation of women. It is not an everyday occurrence for a man to speak to so many women at once, nor does it happen every day that a man suggests to so many women new battles to be joined. A man experiences his first bashfulness the minute he becomes conscious he is looking at a woman. So, sisters, you will understand that despite the joy and the pleasure it gives me to be speaking to you, I still remain a man who sees in every one of you a mother, a sister, or a wife. I hope, too, that our sisters here in Ouagadougou province who don't understand French, the foreign language in which I will be giving my speech, will be patient with us as they always have been. After all, it is they who, like our mothers, accepted the task of carrying us for 9 months without complaint. Comrades, the night of August 4th gave birth to an achievement that was most beneficial for the Burkina people. It gave our people a name and our country new horizons. Imbued with the invigorating sap of freedom, the men of Burkina, the humiliated and outlawed of yesterday, received the stamp of what is most precious in the world, honor and dignity. From this moment on, happiness became accessible. Every day we advance toward it, heady with the first fruits of our struggles, themselves proof of the great stride we have already taken. But this selfish happiness is an illusion. There is something crucial missing. Women. They have been excluded from this joyful procession. Though our men have already reached the edges of this great garden that is the revolution, our women are still confined to a depersonalizing darkness. Among themselves, in voices loud or soft, they talk of the experiences that have enveloped Burkina, experiences that are for them, for the moment, merely a rumble in the distance. The revolution's promises are already a reality for men, but for women, they are still merely a rumor, and yet the authenticity and the future of our revolution depend on women. These are vital and essential questions because nothing whole, nothing definitive or lasting can be accomplished in our country as long as a crucial part of ourselves is kept in this condition of subjugation, a condition imposed over the course of centuries by various systems of exploitation. Starting now, the men and women of Burkina Faso should profoundly change their image of themselves, for they are part of a society that is not only establishing new social revolutions, but is also provoking a cultural transformation, upsetting the relations of authority between men and women, and forcing both to rethink the nature of each. This task is formidable, but necessary. It will determine our ability to bring our revolution to its full stature, unleash its full potential, and show its true meaning for the direct, natural, and necessary relations between men and women, the most natural of all relations between one human being and another. This will show to what extent the natural behavior of man has become human, and to what extent he has realized his human nature. This human being, this vast and complex combination of pain and joy, solidarity and forsaken, yet creator of all humanity, suffering, frustrated, and humiliated, and yet endless source of happiness for each one of us, the source of affection beyond compare, inspiring the most unexpected courage, this being called weak, but possessing untold ability to inspire us to take the road of honor, this being of flesh and blood and of spiritual conviction, this being, women, is you. You are our source of comfort and life companions, our comrades in struggle, who, because of this fact, should by rights assert yourself as equal partners in the joyful victory feast of the revolution. It is in this light that all of us, men and women, must define and assert the role and place of women in society. Therefore, we must restore to man his true image by making the reign of freedom prevail over the differentiations imposed by nature, and by eliminating all systems of hypocrisy that reinforce the shameless exploitation of women. In other words, posing the question of women in Burkina society today means posing the abolition of the system of slavery to which they have been subjected for millennia. The first step is to try to understand how this system functions, to grasp its real nature in all its subtlety, in order then to work out a line of action that can lead to women's total emancipation. In other words, to win this battle, common to men and women, we must be familiar with all aspects of the woman in question on a world as well as natural scale. We must understand how the struggle of Burkina women today is part of the worldwide struggle of all women, and beyond that part, the struggle of the full rehabilitation of our continent. The condition of women is therefore at the heart of the question of humanity itself, here, there, and everywhere. The question is thus universal in character. The class struggle and the worldwide status of women. We undoubtedly owe a debt to a dialectical materialism for having shed the greatest light on the problem of the conditions women face, allowing us to understand the exploitation of women as part of a general system of exploitation. Dialectical materialism defines human society not as a natural, unchanging fact, but as the exact opposite. Humankind does not submit passively to the power of nature. It takes control over this power. This process is not an internal or subjective one. It takes place objectively in practice. Once women cease to be viewed as mere sexual beings Once we look beyond their biological functions and become conscious of their weight as an active social force. What's more, women's consciousness of herself is not only a product of her sexuality, it reflects her position as determined by the economic structure of a society, which in turn expresses the level reached by humankind in technological development and the relations between classes. The imperative and dialectical materialism lies in going beyond the inherent limits of biology, rejecting simplistic theories about our being slaves to the nature of our species, and instead placing in their social and economic context. From the beginning of human history, man's mastering of nature has never been accomplished with his bare hands alone. The hand with the opposable thumb is extended by the tool, which increases the hand's power. It was thus not physical attributes alone, masculinature, or the capacity to give birth, for example, that determined the unequal status of men and women, nor was it technological process as such that institutionalized this inequality. In certain cases, in certain parts of the globe, women were able to eliminate the physical difference that separated them from men. It was the transition from one form of society to another that served to institutionalize women's inequality. This inequality was produced by our own minds and intelligence in order to develop a concrete form of domination and exploitation. The social function and roles to which women have been relegated ever since are a living reflection of this fact today. Her childbearing functions and the social obligation to conform to models of elegance determined by men prevent any woman who might want to from developing a so-called male masculinity. For millennia, from the Paleolithic to the Bronze Age, relations between the sexes were, in the opinion of the most skilled paleontologists, positive and complementary in character. So it was for 8 millennia, relations were based on collaboration and interaction, in contrast to the patriarchy, where women's exclusion is a generalized characteristic of the modern historical era. Frederick Engels not only traced the evolution of technology, but also of the historic enslavement of women, which was born with the arrival of private property, owing to the transition from one mode of production to another, and from one form of social organization to another. With this intensive labor required to clear the forest, cultivate the fields, and put natural resources to best use, a division of labor developed. Selfishness, laziness, looking for the easy way out, in short, taking the most with the least effort, emerged from the depths of the human spirit and became elevated into principles. The protective tendencies of women toward the family and the clan became a trap that delivered her up to domination by the male. innocence and generosity fell victim to deceit and base motives. Love was made a mockery. Dignity was tarnished. All genuine feelings were transferred into objects of barter. From this moment on, women's hospitality and desire to share succumbed to the trickery of the deceitful. Though conscious of this deceit, which imposed on them an unequal share of the burdens, women followed men in order to care for and raise all that they loved. For their part, men exploited women's great self-sacrifice to the hilt. Later, this seed of criminal exploitation established terrible social imperatives, going far beyond the conscious concessions made by women, who had been historically betrayed. Humankind first knew slavery with the advent of private property. Man, master of his slaves and the land, also became the owner of the woman. This was the great historic defeat of the female sex. It came about with the upheaval in the division of labor, a result of new modes of production and a revolution in the means of production. In this way, paternal right replaced material right. Property was now handed down from father to son, rather than as before, from the woman to her clan. The patriarchal family made its appearance, founded on the sole and personal property of the father, who had become head of the family. Within this family, the woman was oppressed. Reigning supreme, the man satisfied his sexual whims by mating with his slaves or concubines. Women became his booty, his conquest in trade. He profited from their labor, power, and took his fill from their myriad of pleasures they afforded him. For their part, as soon as the masters gave them the chance, women took revenge and infidelity. Thus, adultery became the natural counterpart of marriage. It was the woman's only form of defense against the domestic slavery to which she was subjected. Her social oppression was a direct reflection of her economic oppression. Given this cycle of violence, inequality can be done away with only by establishing a new society where men and women enjoy equal rights, resulting from the upheaval in the means of production as well as in all social relations. That is, women's lot will improve only with the elimination of the system that exploits them. In fact, throughout the ages, and wherever the patriarchy triumphed, there has been a close parallel between class exploitation and women's oppression. Of course, there were brighter periods where women, priestesses, or female warriors broke out of their oppressive chains, but the essential features of the subjugation survived and were consolidated both in every way, in everyday activity, and in intellectual and moral repression. Her status overturned by private property, banished from her very self, relegated to the role of child raiser and servant, written out of history by philosophy, and the most entrenched relations stripped of all worth by mythology, Women shared the lot of a slave, who in slave society was nothing more than a beast of burden with a human face. So it is not surprising that in its ascending phase, the capitalist system, for which human beings are just so many numbers, should be the economic system that has exploited women the most, cynically and with the most sophistication. So we are told manufacturers in those days employed only women on their mechanized looms. They gave preference to women who were married, and among them to those with a family at home to support. These women paid greater attention to their work than single women and were more docile. They had no choice but to work to the point of exhaustion to earn the barest substances for their families. In this way, women's particular attributes are used against her, and all the most moral and delicate qualities of her nature become the means by which she is enslaved. Her tenderness, her love for her family, the meticulous care she brings to her work, all this is used against her as she guards against any flaws she may have. Thus, throughout the ages and throughout different types of society, women suffered a sorry fate in a continually reinforced position of inferiority to men. Though the inequality was expressed in many and varied ways, it continued to exist nevertheless. In slave society, the male slave was looked upon as an animal, a means of production of goods and services. The woman, whatever her social rank, was crushed within her own class and outside of the class. This was the case even for women who belonged to the exploiting classes. In feudal society, women were kept in a state of absolute dependency on men, justified by their supposed physical and psychological weakness, often seen as a defiled object and a primary agent of indiscretion. Women, with few rare exceptions, were kept out of places of worship. In a capitalist society, the women already morally and socially procured it also, procured it is also subjugated economically, kept by the man. If she does not work, she remains under a man's domination, even when she works herself to death. We will never be able to paint an adequate picture of the misery women suffer, nor show too strongly that women share the misery of the proletarians as a whole. The specific character of women's oppression. Women's fate is bound up with that of the exploited male. This interdependence arises from the exploitation that both men and women suffer, exploitation that binds them together historically. This should not, however, make us lose sight of the specific reality of women's situation. The condition of their lives are determined by more than economic factors, and they show that women are victims of specific oppression. The specific character of this oppression cannot be explained away by equating different situations through superficial and childish simplifications. It is true that both the women and the male worker are condemned to silence by their exploitation. But under the current system, The worker's wife is always condemned to silence by her worker husband. In other words, in addition to the class exploitation common to both of them, women must confront a particular set of relations that exist between them and men, relations of conflict and violence that use physical differences as their pretext. It's clear that the difference between the sexes is a feature of human society. It's also clear that this difference determines the particular relations that prevent us from viewing women, even in the framework of economic production, as simple female workers. Privilege relations. Privilege relations. The net result is that women's reality continues an ongoing problem. The male uses the complex nature of these relations as an excuse to sow confusion among women. He takes advantage of all the shrewdness that class exploitation has to offer in order to maintain his domination over women. This is the same method used elsewhere by men to rule over other men. They succeed in imposing the idea that certain men, by virtue of their family origin or birth, or by divine right, were superior to others. This was the basis for the feudal system. Other men have managed to enslave whole peoples in this way. They use their origins or arguments based on their skin color as a supposedly scientific justification to rule over those who were unfortunate enough to have skin of a different color. This colonial rule, that's apartheid. We must pay close attention to the situation of women because it pushes the best of them to talk of war of the sexes, when what we really have is a war of social groups and of classes that should simply be waged together, with men and women complementing each other. We have to say, frankly, that it's the attitude of men that makes such confusion possible, that in turn paves the way for the bold assertion made by feminism, some of which have not been without value in the fight that men and women are waging against oppression. This fight is one we can and will win if we understand that we need one another and are complementary and final. If we understand that we are condemned to being complementary, for the time being, we have no choice but to recognize that male behavior, made up of vanity, irresponsibility, arrogance, and violence of all kinds toward women, can in no way result in coordinated action against women's oppression. What can be said of these attitudes which can sink to the level of stupidity and which in reality are nothing but a safety valve for oppressed males who through brutalizing their wives hope to regain some of the human dignity denied them by the system of exploitation. This male stupidity is called sexism and machismo. It includes moral and intellectual impoverishment of all types, even acknowledged or not, physical powerlessness, which often compels politically conscious women to consider it their duty to fight on two fronts, to fight and win, Women must identify with the oppressed layers and classes of society, workers, peasants, and others. The man, however, no matter how oppressed he is, has another human being to oppress, his wife. Saying this means without any doubt asserting a terrible fact. When we talk about the disgusting system of apartheid, for example, our thoughts and emotions turn to the exploited and oppressed blacks. But we forget, unfortunately, the black woman who has to endure her husband. This man, who, armed with his passbook, allows himself all kinds of reprehensible escapades before returning home to the woman who, suffering and destitute, has waited for him with dignity. We should keep in mind, too, the white woman of South Africa. Aristocratic, no doubt, materially satisfied, she is, unfortunately, a tool for the pleasure of her lecherous white men. The only thing these men can do for her, the only thing these men can do to forget their crimes against blacks is to get wildly drunk from bestial sexual behavior. Moreover, there is no lack of examples of men, even through progressive, who live cheerfully in adultery, yet would be ready to murder their wives on the merest suspicion of infidelity. Many men in Burkina seek so-called consolation in the arms of prostitutes and mistresses of all kinds. This is not to mention the irresponsible husbands whose wages serve only to keep mistresses and make the bars richer. And what can be said of these little men, also progressive, who get together and talk lewdly about the women they have taken advantage of? They believe that in this way they'll be able to measure up to other men and even humiliate some of them by seducing married women. In reality, such men are pitiful and insignificant. They would not even enter our discussion if it were not for the fact that their criminal behavior undermines the moral and virtue of many women of great merit, who would have been highly useful in our revolution. And then there are those more or less revolutionary militants, much less revolutionary than more, who do not accept that wives being politically active, or who allow them to be active by day and by day only, or who beat their wives because they've gone out to a meeting or a demonstration in the evening. Oh, these suspicious, jealous men. What narrow-mindedness, and what a limited, partial commitment. For it is only at night that a disappointment and a determined woman can cheat on her husband. And what kind of political commitment is it that expects political activity to cease at nightfall, to resume only at daybreak? And finally, what should we make of remarks about women by all kinds of militants? The one more revolutionary than the next? Remarks such as, women are despicable, or despicably materialistic, profiteers, actors, liars, gossips, schemers, jealous, and so on. Maybe this is all true of women, but surely it is equally true of men. Could our society be any less perverse than this when it systematically places burdens on women? keeps them away from anything that is supposed to be serious and of consequences, and excludes them from anything other than the most petty and minor activities. When you are condemned as a woman are to wait for your master of a husband in order to feed him and receive his permission to speak and to live, what else do you have to keep you occupied and give you at least the illusion of being useful or important other than meaningful glances, gossip, small talk, quarrels, furtive and envious glances, followed by malicious comments on the desire of others to be stylish and on their private lives? The same attitudes are found among men placed in the same situation. Another thing we can say about women is that, unfortunately, they are forgetful. We even call them bird brains. But we must never forget that a woman's life is taken up, even tormented, by a fickle spouse, an unfaithful and irresponsible husband, and by her children and their problems. Worn out by taking care of the entire family, how could she not have haggard eyes that reflect distraction and absent-mindedness? For her, forgetting becomes an antidote to pain, a relief from the harshness of her existence, a vital part of self-preservation. But there are forgetful men too, a lot of them. Some because of drink and drugs, others through indulging in various kinds of perversity while racing through life. However, no one ever says these men are forgetful. What vanity! What banality! Banalities men revel in, and that demonstrate the weakness of the masculine world. Because in a society of exploitation, the masculine world needs women prostitutes. The women are defiled, and after being used, are sacrificed on the altar of prosperity of a system built on the lies of plunder. They are merely scapegoats. Prostitution is nothing but the micronism of a society where exploitation is a general rule. It is a symbol of the contempt men have for women. And yet, this woman is none other than the painful figure of the mother, sister, or wife of other men. Thus, of every one of us, in the final analysis, prostitution reflects the unconscious contempt we have for ourselves. There can be prostitutes only as long as there are prostituters and pimps. Who goes to see prostitutes? First, there are the husbands who commit their wives to chastity while they relieve their depravity and debauchery upon the prostitute. This allows them to treat their wives with seeming respect, while they reveal their true nature to the bosom of the lady of the so-called pleasure. So on the moral plane, prostitution becomes the counterpart of marriage. Tradition, customs, religion, and moral doctrines alike seem to have no difficulty adapting themselves to it. Thus is what our church fathers mean when they explain that sewers are needed to assure the cleanliness of the palace. Then there are the unrepentant and intemperate pleasure seekers who are afraid to take on the responsibility of a home with its ups and downs, and who flee from the moral and material responsibility of fatherhood. So they exploit a discreetly located brothel as a treasure trove, of liaisons without consequences. There is also the group of men who publicly, at least and in proper company, subject women to vicious public attack, either because some disappointment that they did not have the strength or character to surmount, thus losing confidence in all women, who then become tools of the devil, or else out of hypocrisy proclaiming their contempt for the female sex too often and categorically, a contempt they strive to assume in the eyes of society, from which they force admiration on false pretenses. All these men end up at night after night in brothel until occasionally their hypocrisy is discovered. Then there is the weakness of the man who is looking for a polyandrous arrangement. Far be it from us to make a value judgment on polyandry, which was the dominant form of relations between men and women in certain societies. But we are denouncing here are the flocks of idle, money-grubbing gigolos lavishly kept by rich ladies. Within this same system, prostitution can, economically speaking, include both the prostitute and the materialist-minded married woman. The only difference between the woman who sells her body through prostitution and she who sells herself in marriage is the price and duration of the contract. So, by tolerating the existence of prostitution, we lower all our women in the same level, whether prostitute or wife. The only difference between the two is that the legal wife, though still oppressed, at least has the benefit of the stamp of respectability that marriage confers. As for the prostitute, all that remains for her is the exchange value of her body, a value that fluctuates according to what's in the male chauvinist's wallet. Isn't she just an object, taking on more or less value according to the degree to which her charms fade? Isn't she governed by the law of supply and demand? Prostitution is concentrated, tragic, and painful summary of female slavery in all its forms. We would therefore see in every prostitute an accusing finger pointing at society as a whole. Every pimp, every partner in prostitution turns that knife in the festering and gaping wound that disfigures the world of man and leads to his ruin. By fighting prostitution, by holding out a helping hand to the prostitute, we are saving our mothers, our sisters, and our wives from the social leprosy. We are saving ourselves. We are saving the world. Women's reality in Burkina Faso. While society sees the birth of a boy as a gift from God, the birth of a girl is greed, as an act of fate, or at best, a gift that can be used to produce food and perpetuate the human race. The little male will be taught how to want and get, to speak up and be served, to desire and take, to decide things on his own. The future woman, however, is dealt a blow after blow by society that unanimously, as one man is the appropriate term, drums into her head norms that lead nowhere. A psychological straitjacket called virtue produces a spirit of personal alienation within her Concern with being protected is nurtured in the child's mind, inclining her to seek the supervision of a protector or negotiator for a marriage. What a monstrous mental fraud. And so this child knows no childhood. From the age of 3, she must meet the requirements of her role in life to serve and be useful, while her brother of 4 or 5 or 6 will play until he drops from exhaustion or boredom. She, with little ceremony, will enter the process of production. She already has a trade, assistant housewife. It is, of course, an unpaid position. For isn't it generally said that a housewife does nothing? Don't we write housewife on the identity card of women who have no income, meaning they have no job, that they are not working? With the help of tradition and obligatory submissiveness, our sisters grow up more and more dependent, more and more dominated, more and more exploited, with less and less leisure or free time. While the young man's road includes opportunities to blossom and take charge of his life, at every new stage of the young girl's life, the social straitjacket is pulled tighter around her. She will pay a heavy price for having been born female, and she will pay it throughout her whole life until the weight of her toil and the efforts physically and mentally of her selflessness lead her to the day of eternal rest. She is an instrument of production at the side of her mother, who from that moment on is already more a boss than a mother. She will never sit idle, nor be left alone to her games and toys like her brother. Whichever direction we turn from the Central Plateau in the northeast, dominated by societies where power is highly centralized, to the west, where the powers of the village communities are decentralized, or to the southwest, the land of the so-called segmental communities, traditional social organizations have at least one point in common: the subordination of women. In over 8,000 villages on our 600,000 plots of land, and in our million-plus households, on the question of women, we can see identical or similar approaches. From one end of the country to the other, social cohesion as defined by men requires the submission of women and the subordination of the young. Our society, still primitively agrarian, patriarchal, and polygamous, turns the woman into an object of exploitation for her labor, power, and consumptions, for her biological reproductive capacity. How does the woman manage to live out this peculiar dual identity which makes her the vital link that keeps the whole family together? The link whose presence and attention guarantees the family's fundamental unity, while at the same time guaranteeing she will be marginalized and ignored. The woman leads a twofold existence indeed, the depth of her social ostracism being equaled only by her stoic endurance to live in harmony with the society of man, to conform with men's demands. She resigns herself to a self-efficient that is demeaning. She sacrifices herself. Women, source of life, yet object. Mother, yet servile domestic. Nurturer, yet trophy. exploited in the fields and at home, yet playing the role of a faceless, voiceless extra. The pivot, the link, yet in chains. Female shadow of the male shadow. The woman is the pillar of the family well-being. The midwife, washerwoman, cleaner, cook, errand runner, matron, farmer, healer, gardener, grinder, saleswoman, worker. She is labor power working with obsolete tools, putting in hundreds of thousands of hours for an appalling level of production. Our sisters fighting as they are on the forefronts of our war against disease, hunger, poverty, degeneracy. Feel the pressure of changes which they have no control. For every struggle, one of the 800,000 males who immigrate, a woman takes on an additional load. The 2 million Burkina men who live outside the country thus exacerbate the imbalance in the sex ratio. That puts women today at 51.7% of the total population of 52.1% of the resident population. That is potentially part of the workforce. Too busy to give the necessary attention to her children, too exhausted to think of herself, the woman continues to slave away. Wheel of fortune, wheel of friction, drive wheel, spare wheel, Ferris wheel, broken on the wheel, and bullied. Women, our sisters and wives, pay for having created life, socially relegated to third place after the man and the child. They pay for sustaining life. Here, too, a third world is arbitrarily held back to be dominated, to be exploited, subjugated. The woman goes from a protective guardian who exploits her to one who dominates her and exploits her even more. She is first to work and last to rest. She is first to go for water and wood, first at the fire, yet last to quench her thirst. She may eat only if there is food left, and only after the man. She is the keystone of the family, carrying both family, society on her shoulders, in her hands and in her belly. In return, she is paid with oppressive pro-birth ideology, food taboos and restriction, overwork, malnutrition, dangerous pregnancies, deeper depersonalization, and innumerable other evils that make maternal deaths one of the most intolerable, unspeakable, and shameful defects of our society. Given this foundation of alienation, the intrusion of predators from afar encourages the isolation of women, making their condition even more precarious. The euphoria of independence left women behind in a bed of dashed hopes, forced into segregated discussions, absent from decisions, vulnerable, and thus the primary victim. They remained at the mercy of family and society. Capital and bureaucracy have banded together and kept women subjugated. Imprisoned. Imperialism has done the rest. Only half as likely as men to attend school, women are 99% illiterate, have little training in trades, and are discriminated against in employment and confined to the worst jobs, and are the first to be harassed and fired, yet burdened as they are by 100 traditions, and 1,000 excuses, women have continued to rise to meet challenge after challenge. They have had to keep going, whatever the cost, for the sake of their children, their family, and for society in general. Though 1,000 nights without a dawn, capitalism needed cotton, shea butter, and sesame for its industries, and it was women, it was our mothers, who, in addition to all the tasks they were already carrying out, found themselves responsible for harvesting these products too. In the towns where civilization is supposedly a liberating force for women, they found themselves decorating Borges's living rooms, selling their bodies to survive, or serving as commercial bait and to advertising. Women from the pretty